Good evening and welcome to this IEA panel discussion to discuss the question, should we abolish the DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport? And delighted that we have speakers this evening, David Elstein, who is chairman of openDemocracy and a former chief executive of Channel 5, is that correct? Yes. Dominique Lazanski, who's head of digital policy at the TaxPayers Alliance. Martin Jeune will be joining us a bit later, we hope, and he is the founder of OpenRoad. Mark Littlewood is the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. That's not real smoke that's coming out of his steam generated by an electrical device which pumps nicotine into his body. And Professor Shackleton, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham, and they're all going to take different aspects of this question. We expect to run a series of similar events, moving on to easier cases such as should we abolish the Department for Education, the Department for International Development and the Department for Health. And the inspiration really for this discussion is this book that we published to much acclaim last year, Sharper Axes, Lower Taxes, Big Steps to a Smaller State, when we were making the case basically that if the government was going to use up so much political capital on really rather small spending cuts, it may as well do the job properly and move the United Kingdom closer to the sort of situation that prevails in Switzerland. So, David is going to take us away first.
I was just trying to work out how the United Kingdom would get to Switzerland, presumably by lorry across Europe, but it would take us a bit of time. The Ministry of Fun is nearly 20 years old, having started life on April the 11th, 1992 as the Department for National Heritage. The creation of this new cabinet post was widely seen as a political reward for David Mellor MP, who had helped steer through the Broadcasting Act of 1990 with its controversial auctioning of ITV franchises. Unfortunately for Mellor, the fun only lasted 5 months, at which point various press revelations forced his resignation, as the Sun so elegantly put it, from toe job to no job. His successors included Peter Brook, Stephen Durrell and Virginia Bottomley, before Tony Blair's victory in 1997 saw the department redefined as that for culture, media and sport. Chris Smith and Tessa Jowell had lengthy stints as Secretary of State. James Purnell, Andy Burnham and Ben Bradshaw much shorter ones. Although the job is quite high profile, heavyweight politicians see it as too marginal to be a base for building a career. Both Purnell and Burnham were in and out within a year. Curiously, Jeremy Hunt, having shadowed DCMS for some years in opposition and widely seen as a rising star amongst the Conservatives, seemed happy to keep the portfolio when the coalition took office, despite it being by far the smallest spending department in Whitehall. In normal times, the DCMS is responsible for just 1.6 billion of the state's 700 billion of expenditure every year. Less than a third the amount that just one of its clients, the BBC, spends annually. Last year, this year and next year, that 1.6 billion is inflated by spending over £1 billion a year on the Olympics. Another story, another day. Hunt has reclaimed the Olympics as part of his title. Previously it had been hived off to Tessa Jowell after she'd been booted out from the rest of the department. The theory behind the DCMS was to bring together a collection of responsibilities that had previously been spread around Whitehall within education, the Home Office, business, environment, Privy Council and so on. It's not obvious, however, why gambling and alcohol licensing, surely better run from the Home Office, need to be aligned with broadband rollout, surely better run from the Business Department. There also seems to be a strange mismatch between the department's responsibilities, broadcasting, libraries, museums, sport, tourism, and its stated strategic objectives. Children and young people, communities, delivery, economy, and the Olympic Games and their legacy. Perhaps Mr. Hunt has spent too much time imbibing deeply at the well of Cameronian social theory. In the Conservative preparation for the election and in the DCMS strategic plan, two subjects loom large: cutting back on Ofcom and launching local TV. Yet there's little sign of restricting Ofcom's activities. Indeed, Hunt's number 2, Ed Vaizey, went on record last month as saying that Ofcom was an exemplary regulator. Local TV is indeed being pursued energetically. Mr. Hunt has long been on record as regarding local TV as the biggest gap in our broadcasting landscape. But the tiny role it is likely to play in the rich media mix the UK enjoys seems wholly disproportionate to the effort being expended to introduce it. Do we need the DCMS? Mr. Hunt has already partly answered the question. He's in the process of cutting his staff and his administration costs in half. So if one half can easily go, maybe the other half can as well. Oddly enough, the DCMS has also quietly chopped down the stated value of the creative industries in the UK, for which it has policy responsibility. They've gone, magically, in the stroke of a pen last Christmas, from £59 billion a year to £36 billion a year. I didn't think that was part of the comprehensive spending review, but actually what happened was that the statisticians removed consulting and software programming from the definition of creative industries. There you go, just like magic. But there is a serious point to the question. It goes without saying that all the functions carried out by the DCMS could either be dropped or redistributed around Whitehall broadly along the pre-1992 lines. But would that undermine an attempt to deliver what used to be called joined-up thinking within government? Or could these functions usefully be joined up with other similar functions in other departments? For instance, there's already joint responsibility for Ofcom, shared with the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, BIS. Indeed, but for Vince Cable's foolish utterances about Rupert Murdoch, responsibility for vetting the proposed News Corp B-Sky B merger, Mr. Hunt's most visible public role in the first half of last year, would have remained with BIS where it actually belongs. More importantly, the DCMS lacks clout. A minuscule department is poorly placed to attract high-flying civil servants. It's no secret that clients of the DCMS and the larger departments of state regard the quality of staff there as low. Cutting half of them will be no great loss in the eyes of those with that opinion. But the biggest drawback of lacking clout is that even when you make a decision, you may not be able to make it stick. In 1999, Gavin Davis, before he became the BBC's chairman, wrote an extensive report on the future funding of the BBC. He concluded that a supplementary digital licence fee was necessary to fund any further extension of BBC services. The BBC, a little reluctantly, concurred. Chris Smith, the Secretary of State, agreed. And then ITV and B-Sky B joined forces to lobby against a digital licence fee, arguing that it might damage their own ventures in digital pay TV. They didn't bother with Chris Smith. They didn't even bother with Gordon Brown, Gavin Davis's good friend. They went straight to Tony Blair, and the digital licence fee was dumped. The accepted wisdom is that the lovies and the media enjoy having their very own ministry. Capture is not very difficult, and one has only to read the weekly email from Ed Vaizey's office to understand that this is the most touchy-feely department in government. Whom did Ed meet last week? The Children's Laureate, Julia Donaldson, Susie Hargreaves of the Internet Watch Foundation, David Way of the National Apprenticeship Service, Stephen Moore of Media Cinema, Anthony Jones of the Wedgwood Trust, and, curiously enough, Michael Gove, the Education Secretary, whom you would have thought he might have bumped into in the House of Commons lobby. There you go. I'm sure we all feel better for knowing all about that. Now, all departments experience the problem of both representing and policing the special interests within their remit. Is putting yet more lottery funding and tax breaks into the British film industry good news or bad news? Good for the industry? Arguably. Good for the taxpayers and the muggins who do the lottery? Arguably not. Conversely, when Vaizey and Hunt abruptly wound up the UK Film Council, there were cheers from those who complained that under Labour, the DCMS had been thoroughly lovied up with a dozen or more film and telly peers in the House of Lords. Yet it turned out that the department had no idea how it replaced the Film Council or its functions, and the spatchcocked outcome shows no signs of making any savings. Indeed, the National Audit Office concluded The department's decision in 2010 to close and merge a number of arm's-length bodies was not informed by a financial analysis of the cost and benefits of the decision. The department did not obtain sufficient financial data about the bodies and based its decisions on estimates that did not take into account the full costs of closures such as lease cancellation, redundancy and pension crystallisation costs. The decision was also not informed by an estimation of future savings or what the payback period would be. A complete bullseye. We have yet to see whether the change of government will put an end to the weak financial management that's characterised the department. As the NAO put it, the department has a history of overcommitting its budget allocations across its arm's-length bodies. In April 2009, initial forecasts for 2009-10 showed capital budgets have been overcommitted by 95 million and in 2010-11 by 110 million pounds. The department had to negotiate with HM Treasury for access to an additional 120 million of budgetary cover and then find 70 million pound of reductions in planned expenditure to balance the books. Given that the DCMS capital budget in 2010-11, excluding the Olympics, was just 200 million pounds, an overcommitment of 110 million pounds does seem fairly excessive. And yet, if we look at the DCMS budget for this year, of the total of 1.65 billion, 540 million goes on museums and galleries, 388 million on the Arts Council, 228 million on media, including 90 million on S4C, 176 million on sports bodies like Sport England and UK Sport, and 166 million on heritage. Departmental admin costs are actually just 51 million pounds, which, by the way, is rounded up in the summary accounts to 100 million. But there you go. If it had been 49 million, it would have been naught. Unless some of these activities are to be abandoned, and the cost of S4C has already been transferred to the licence fee, then closing the DCMS will simply move them elsewhere in Whitehall. Of course, they may be better managed there, but a decision to reduce their cost will be independent of whether the DCMS survives or not. Even the admin costs might not be entirely eliminated if some are, as I suspect, inevitably attached to managing the arm's length bodies rather than the department itself. At best, we might save £1 a year per household by closing the DCMS. So the real issue is almost certainly not cash, but effectiveness. Was the bringing together of the DCMS portfolio helpful? And if so, to whom? And would redistributing it be harmful? And again, if so, to whom? It's only on balance that I come to the view that a small department with substandard performance tends to do citizens and clients few favours. But I also take the view that larger departments, even if they attract a better class of Mandarin, will make their own characteristic mistakes, but bigger ones, and cost the taxpayer even more in the process, witness the Department of Defence. I leave it to the audience to choose between the lesser of these two evils, given that smaller government generally seems to be beyond our reach. Thank you.
I'd like to thank David for covering so many of the financial aspects of DCMS, but for forgetting one really important thing. Ed Vasey takes wonderful trips to Hollywood every 6 months that he reports greatly about in his weekly emails, so we must not forget about that. And he, of course, visits places like Warner Brothers and other startups. But anyway, my work takes me into DCMS quite a lot as I cover digital policy, so I attend a fair number of roundtable meetings. And so tonight I was going to cover two things, one on the budget, which again David has covered quite a bit, and a bit on digital and internet issues at DCMS. I'd like to point out there's a wonderful organogram on the DCMS website that'll show you how everything breaks down by size, just in case you can't quite figure out the allocation. But as David said, you know, the total budget looks like it'll be 1.6 billion this year. And again, that doesn't include the Olympics or the broadband subsidy, which is coming in at about 630 million, 530 million for rural broadband rollout, which hasn't happened yet, and another 100 million for countries or for cities like Manchester and places like that. But in any case, Ed Vaizey has a wide remit, not just internet, but he also covers, as again David said, heritage and libraries and film and various things like that. But he's spending a lot of time right now with the digital companies and internet companies. He hosts on average 2 to 3 roundtable business meetings a week. And when you start thinking about people coming from places like Yahoo and Google and taking so much time out of their week to talk to Ed Vaizey again and again about a number of things, it's quite a lot of time spent. And if we really think about it, is this really good time spent? Is he really encouraging frank conversation that internet companies and other tech companies are already doing themselves? I'm not really quite sure. But the point of Ed doing this is that he's trying to bring together internet companies and tech companies for self-regulatory reasons. So he's pushing self-regulation while ironically making them come into government, many times a week. And the self-regulation that he's working on right now has to do with the European Commission level regulation. So that's the cookies law, that's net neutrality, that's a lot of other impacts to the companies here that we're going to see with the data protection directive. And so he's basically not only doing everything he's doing for DCMS, he's also running in between the European Commission and here. And I was told recently at a meeting at the European Commission that he's a wonderful champion for the internet, and we see him all the time. And you start to worry when your libraries, minister and your internet minister is running around the world. I was also at a conference with him in Kenya last year, where he spent about a week looking at Kenyan startups before going to China. Is this really a good and effective way to use our money? This year, one last thing I want to talk about that DCMS is looking at is the communications bill, which is due for 2013, is going through the green paper and white paper consultation stages. And Ed Vaizey is leading that particular discussion with industry as well, and I'll be in on some of those meetings to kind of sit there and wonder really if it's worth it. Through that introductory of that, the regulation and the comms bill that's coming out, we will see a lot more regulation placed on digital economy companies, tech companies, internet companies, and creative industries, but probably less so for the creative industries. And so he will be spending a lot of time and probably going to a lot of really nice dinners as well. Throughout that whole process. And quite frankly, as someone who thinks a lot about tax at the Taxpayers Alliance, I'm going to ask this question again. Is this a really good way of time spent and of money spent for an economy that, if just a little bit government would step back from, I think that the digital economy would grow just a bit more. If they just eased off the obsession with website blocking for copyright, for you name it, for child protection, for everything in between, that would foster the economy more than the DCMS in its own right. So the proposal tonight is to question whether or not we should abolish DCMS. And as David also said, a lot of the functions that Ed is covering under the internet and digital remit was a part of BIS prior to this and was looked after by fewer staff from the research that I've done. So I think that abolishing DCMS wholesale would be a great idea, and especially abolishing the aspects of the internet and digital economy, which, quite frankly, if there was any need to have any kind of discussion or regulation, could possibly be covered by a third of a Mandarin at BIS. So I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
I do apologise both to my fellow members of the panel and to you as the audience for my late arrival. I had to travel in from Brussels this evening. Sorry about that. I'll be brief, and I want to cover the future of DCMS under 3 main headings: the principle, the practice, and the policy. I guess what we're really considering here today, initially at least, is not whether there should be a building with a brass plate on the outside that says Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I think actually it's a stone. It's a stone nameplate. It's about whether the functions which the department carries out are valid ones for government. And I apologise if David covered this, but as you all probably know by now, we are talking here about sport, including principally at the moment the Olympics, which is as far as all the officials I talk to, seems to be an obsession with the DCMS. Arts, broadly defined, including museums and galleries, both national and local. Broadcasting and digital media, we've had alluded to already. Telecommunications, uneasily spatchcocked into the department in a way which is very countercultural for DCMS civil servants. Incidentally, are there any DCMS officials here tonight? That is a great shame.
You can be as rude as you want.
Former officials in DCMS? You see. Right. Now, it can be seen at once, if you just run down this list, that even for somebody who's very rigorous about the free market, and I am very rigorous, I hope, about the free market, we'll see that there are probably areas of activity and policy within that list that if you're a free marketeer, on the one hand you think, why is the government, why is the state doing that? But there are also residual regulatory functions tucked away in those various areas that would have to be done somewhere. Okay. There are areas there where there could or would be market failure. Who regulates them is a different matter, but they'll be done within government and some entity. Whether they require a department of their own, with the panoply and the budgets described of ministers and advisors and officials and buildings and so forth, is another question. And I'd have to say that when you look at those activities, there are some which, to my mind at least, seem very difficult to justify. And it saddens me in a way to say that expenditure on arts and heritage and on sport, both of which are things I personally very much enjoy, fall within the hard to justify category. I enjoy them, but I also recognise there's no earthly reason why my pleasures should be subsidised by the tax pounds of those who do not. Nor do I find arguments that we often hear about the need of spending money on sport for national prestige to be terribly convincing. Far less convincing the arguments about spending money on sport in order to keep the nation fit, which probably failed over the last 10, 15, 20 years as we've all got fatter. And the final idea, the old idea that spending money on sport was important because it brought people and nations together, I think that was exploded by George Orwell many years ago in a famous essay and hardly bears examination. These are the end points of what were once originally very well-intentioned schemes, particularly immediately after the Second World War, to bring the finer things of life to the masses, to the working classes, as people used to say in those days. And they might once have been justified by market failure arguments, about expenditure arguments, but now, as I think David very eloquently put it, many of them have largely been captured by middle class special interest groups and represent the transfer of resources from the poor to the rich with very little justification. So on that basis, filled with free market fervour, we'll abolish the DCMS, shall we? Well, let's turn now from principle to practice, because I think we ought to be practical people, and we know that the DCMS is not going to be abolished, right? I mean, it's very difficult to imagine a government which would remove the department lock, stock and barrel, at least in the next 5 or 10 years. Beyond that, it would be impossible to guess. Now, is it possible, therefore, to envisage a smaller and better version of DCMS? That's a more practical question for us to consider. Now, I think the coalition, for all its faults, and I'm sure this room isn't full of cheerleaders for the Cameron Clegg Alliance, for all its faults, the coalition is doing some things relative to the DCMS. It is reducing its numbers, it is reducing its budget, and once the famous Olympics are out of the way, those numbers will continue to fall. An insider said to me that the department was already looking like less than half it had been in the last years of the Brown regime in numbers, headcount that is. And I want to add my personal note here because some years ago I worked in a lesser version of the very same department. In those days it wasn't called the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, it was called the Office of Arts and Libraries, much more modest title. And this was before the empire building that went on, first under a largely forgotten cabinet minister of the Conservative era called David Mellor, who some of you may remember, and then subsequently under the first years of the Blair regime when it transmuted into DCMS. And I remember the Office of Arts and Libraries very well. It was a sort of genteel branch of Whitehall, in which good-hearted but frankly rather time-expired civil servants dispensed modest sums of money to their pet organisations. It would have done very well, actually, as the setting of a minor and not very amusing Gilbert and Sullivan opera, if you can conceive of the picture I'm painting. I'm very sure it was inefficient. I don't think it was markedly more inefficient than its successor bodies. And indeed, because of its relatively small size, it was probably easier to scrutinise as far as ministers and special advisors were concerned. I was the private secretary to the then minister, so I had that perspective. What it didn't do was broadcasting, which in government terms does mean essentially the BBC, secondly other public service broadcast, and last, very much least, the commercial sector. Nor did it do sport. Now, a gigantic bureaucracy in its own right, led principally by Sport England. Now, I've dealt with sport already. I would like to say that as far as the extensive apparatus of government facing about broadcasting is concerned, I think it's increasingly difficult to understand why we run such a sizable government-sponsored broadcasting and digital media organisation, the BBC, and beyond that, why we intervene in the market to protect other public service broadcasters at all. That is a huge debate, and I can only give you my headline view on that. So already we think sport, no; broadcasting, no. We're already taking two big leaps towards a much smaller, much less grandiose version of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And I will conclude by using the DCMS, as David did, I think, to some extent, as a handy case study for some wider thoughts about how government works. Speaking as somebody who spent over a decade in the civil service, not only in that department, but in the Cabinet Office. And the truth about government departments, as I think we all know, is that they are like owners and their dogs. They and their client organisations and sectors grow to resemble one another and have similar interests and outlooks over time. It's natural. And as they fight for those sectors, as they battle within Whitehall for resources and money, they push for new responsibilities and new initiatives. And that isn't because they are staffed by power-crazy ministers or incompetent officials. They may be staffed by and those, but that's not the main reason. It's simply the natural function of being in a bureaucracy. That is what bureaucracies do. So our task collectively as voters and active citizens is to say to ourselves, having or not having the DCMS is therefore not merely a technical issue, as I implied at the start. It's got important implications to the UK's approach to all its responsibilities. Once you have a department and give it a series of defined areas, you are effectively building for yourself a hothouse, planting seeds, and watching them grow. And if before you know it, you will have a luxuriant jungle of regulation, spending, publicity initiatives, and all the other things that go with modern government. So if we are to have a DCMS at all, like other government departments, every year we must challenge it to do less with less. And then in the end it won't matter whether the department's nameplate says DCMS, OAL, or Department of National Heritage, whatever it says, it will be a better place to do policy.
RIP would be better.
I was reflecting a few hours ago this afternoon why on earth I'd either volunteered to speak on this panel or indeed why I'd been asked to. Unlike the other speakers, I don't profess any expertise in this area, either academically or indeed professionally. It is true that I've worked as a spin doctor, but I've never worked for the media as such. I consider myself a proud Philistine. My interest in the areas of culture supported by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport are virtually zero. I certainly have not played any sport which could reasonably be considered to be competitive in the last 25 years. And I am proud of all of those secrets. But I suppose I am rolled out because of those views as the IEA spokesman on being a Philistine, and to explain why the various grand cultural projects of this department are not worth spending money on and cause me offence as a taxpayer that I am being obliged to spend money on. So in terms of a big step, it's already been outlined by the other speakers. This would not be a huge step financially to abolish the DCMS. I think my reading of the annual budget is about 2.7 billion, about half of that being in current expenditure and about half of it in capital expenditure for this year. So if, in financial terms, even if scrapped entirely and no functions retained, the impact on global government spending would be minuscule. However, in terms of big steps, DCMS potentially represents several areas of government activity which, in my view, can be and should be eradicated altogether. And to this extent, its abolition would represent a substantial qualitative step to a smaller state, if not a substantial quantitative step in reducing government expenditure. And my case is that virtually every aspect of the department's work should not be undertaken by the state at all. If there are, and I'm reluctant to concede this, if there are any residual aspects whatsoever that you may wish to cling on to, these can be easily wrapped up into other departments, thus returning us not just to the pre-1992 days prior to the establishment of the Department of National Heritage, which morphed into DCMS some years later, but leaving us with a governmental structure that simply does less in this area. Now, I had the occasion earlier to read Jeremy Hunt's vision in this year's DCMS business plan, which shows, I believe, actually a lack of vision and indeed a lack of any discernible strategy. It is true that he doesn't fall for some of the hyperbole he was guilty of a couple of weeks ago when he encouraged people not to stay away from the Olympics this summer, but to, I quote, "come and enjoy what will be the most exciting time in British history." Which does seem rather a grand claim, even for a £12 billion sporting event, and even if you are the keenest fan of synchronised swimming and pole vaulting. His vision statement further goes on to say that the DCMS is about removing barriers to innovation and levelling the playing field, whatever that means. Where the market will not deliver, the government's role is to redress the balance, he says. That perhaps explains why we are spending so much on synchronised swimming and pole vaulting, not very demanded sports in the free market, and leaving football to it. Funding, he does say, should not be an excuse for dependence. We want to see our cultural institutions adapt their business models, liberating them to raise and spend money as they see fit. Further on in the document, there is an explicit acceptance actually, of past failures. The department will no longer over-regulate, nor will it spend as much money on administration, and that to some small degree is being addressed. But nevertheless, there is an insistence that every child should have the opportunity to play a musical instrument, which may be hard to achieve, I would have thought, without more regulation. In the very few minutes I have, I just want to consider each of the department's three strands in its name. Sport. The principal current focus, as others have said here, is of course on the Olympics, which on most estimates will run to a cost of something like 600% over and above the initial budget. The department has shown a determination to retain an Olympic legacy, which is deeply unlikely to ensure that much is recouped from the Olympic Stadium, for example. At various stages, both West Ham United and Tottenham Hotspurs, who have shown an interest in purchasing or leasing the stadium for the purpose of playing the popular sport of association football, have come up against a departmental insistence on retaining a running track and the ability to host athletics events, which I think makes the stadium a candidate to become a white elephant. A suggestion from one of the clubs that they would rebuild an athletics stadium at their own expense in Crystal Palace was not sufficient. Apparently the Olympic legacy needs to be postcode specific. Sport England and UK Sport, which I believe to be merged, receive about £150 million per annum in grants, and one might argue, I'm not sure that I would argue, but one might clearly argue that the youth element of sports here could be a legitimate use of state funds. But then, like ensuring that kids are brought up to play the xylophone or consider a career as a saxophonist, this surely should be a competence transferred to the Department of Education, if it exists at all. In culture, I reread today David Sawyer's excellent and still relevant 1993 IEA publication, Current Controversies No. 7, Should the Taxpayer Support the Arts? He points out, of course, that arts and culture flourished in the United Kingdom long before the Arts Council came into existence. Indeed, he argues that British theatre may well have gained from the absence of royal patronage, which was much more common in continental countries, thereby dominating the development of drama through their court theatres. When I've come across in public debate supporters of arts subsidies, they have tended to put a twofold and contradictory argument. The first argument goes that some arts would not exist without the state subsidy, as there is not a sufficient interest to sustain them, and our life is enriched for ensuring that they are maintained. The second argument is that state-subsidised productions, such as Bend It Like Beckham or Warhorse, are profitable, both in their own right and in terms of positive externalities for the rest of the economy. Therefore it is wise to subsidise them. In my view, Group A should cease to exist, and Group B would continue to exist without, of course, the need for any state involvement at all. It is surely not the role of the DCMS to play the role of venture capitalist on behalf of taxpayers. There's also the point, although from what I've actually looked through today, hard evidence on this is hard to precisely measure, that subsidies are indeed regressive, which may make them politically popular amongst the middle classes, but surely calls into question their social use. The media, I want to provoke a few ideas here on the media, and leaving aside the issue of the BBC. If you're going to have a state broadcaster, which I wouldn't have, but if you're going to have a state broadcaster, I suppose you do need some sort of regulatory framework for it. But putting that issue aside, in my view, state regulation of the media is very probably undesirable in virtually every aspect, but more to the point, is now increasingly impossible. That's not to say that no regulation is desirable, just that self-regulation is increasingly possible and increasingly adopted. For example, controls by adults to ensure certain material is not accessible on their children's computers. The Leveson inquiry, in my view, shows, however, how, indeed, state regulation is increasingly impossible. It may be applied to specific media, licensed to broadcast television pictures, for example, or a newspaper, although I do find it increasingly difficult to define what a newspaper might be in legal terms. But although I didn't see his evidence today, I thought that Paul Staines, also known as Guido Fawkes, summed up some of the problems that the inquiry has. He said that he was an Irish citizen, a free citizen of a republic since 1922, the republic since 1922, not his age, and he therefore did not feel bound by the order of a British judge, and indeed he ran his website out of Los Angeles. It does seem to me rather difficult to imagine what sort of British structure you could bring in place to regulate the likes of the Guido Fawkes website. And as internet and television increasingly morph, the sort of regulatory regime that you would actually need to deliver the desired results would, in my view, become unacceptably draconian, even if technically possible. The two, I suppose you could call them television channels that I've watched the most over recent weeks have been Fox News, which, according to its own slogan, is fair and balanced, but I'm not sure would pass the Ofcom test in this regard. And which is broadcast for free over the internet, and NFL.com, which is a pay-for site which gives you, in anywhere outside of the United States of America, direct access to every American football game, and indeed includes in it all of the advertisements broadcast on the domestic American television station, thereby escaping any advertising standards authorities' considerations whatsoever. So I think media regulation by the state is increasingly anachronistic. Superfast broadband, Dominique has already touched on, potentially the HS2 of the internet era. So I would just say in conclusion that not much of what DCMS does needs to be done or should be done at all in a free society. Any minor residual functions, which even them, those I'm sceptical about, can be transferred elsewhere, probably either to the Education Department or to the Home Office. And our hope must be that the Olympic Games is a disaster, not in security or safety terms, of course, but certainly in terms of the athletic achievement or lack of it of British athletes, in order to engender sufficient scepticism afterwards that actually this department needs to go in something rather quicker than the 5 to 10 year time horizon that Martin predicts. Thanks very much for your time.
Yes, I'd read Mark's curse on the Olympics on a website somewhere recently. I'm unlucky enough to be last in this programme, and not knowing what anybody was going to speak about beforehand, I had to dive in and think of something. So I'm going to actually talk about sport in more detail. It's been touched on by a couple of the speakers, but I've got some slightly different things to say about it, I think. we've already heard that the amount of money actually spent by the government on sport is relatively small. But I would say it's a little bit larger than the amounts mentioned. The department is certainly only spending about 176 million on sport this year, only. In addition, the two bodies which largely handle the funding, which is Sport England and UK Sport, also receive large amounts of money from that highly regressive, albeit voluntary, tax system, the National Lottery. Last year, Sport England alone, for example, made grant commitments of £250 million from that source, considerably more than they received in grants from DCMS. Remember also that sport is, in constitutional terms, a devolved activity, with the governments or devolved administrations of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland each spending additional amounts in proportion to their size. Furthermore, going outside the boundaries of DCMS, large amounts are spent by local government on sport. It's difficult to get an exact figure on this, but I guesstimate it to be about £400 to £500 million a year by local authorities across the UK. There is also some taxpayers' money beginning to go to sport via our contribution to the European Union. One of the little noticed features of the Lisbon Treaty, for example, was the creation of a new competence, and what a word that is, a new competence in sport, which is to support, coordinate or supplement the actions of member states. I won't bore you with the list of functions which come under that heading, but it's quite substantial and more than the objective listed by the DCMS, for example, in relation to sport. So we'll hear more about that, I think, in future, because once the European Commission gets its hands on some money and some competence, who knows where that will lead. Now, of course, all this spending is, as has been mentioned before, out with what's planned for the Olympics. Officially set at £9 billion, of course, in the years leading up to and immediately following the Olympics and Paralympic Games. This figure is almost certainly a significant understatement of the expenditure incurred, as the National Audit Office has pointed out. But anyway, even on that figure, to put it slightly differently, each of the 10,000 or so competitors at the Olympics will be subsidised by the taxpayers to the extent of about £1 million each. So all in all, there is a hefty amount of public money, I think, going into public and quasi-public money, like national lottery spending, going into the promotion of sport. And I think we can legitimately ask, why? Sport isn't, despite what has been mentioned once or twice already, an obvious case of market failure, whatever that much abused term means. Many areas of sport are actually rolling in money. From consumers, and we know that expenditure on both participatory sport and spectator sport has been rising as a proportion of household spend for the last 20 years or so. Consumers are spending more on sport. Business investment is going into sport in a big way, far more than in the past. And of course there is the whole area of corporate and private sponsorship of sporting activities, which has grown exponentially over the last 2 decades. Perhaps even more importantly than this, I think that I mentioned this on a previous occasion here, that sport in the UK at least is an exemplary part of civil society, or if you prefer David Cameron's version, the big society. Sporting organisations have a long history of roots in the community, in churches, workplace, localities and so on. They've developed hugely sophisticated sets of rules, tournaments, infrastructure, and they've made wonderful links across the world between sportsmen and sportswomen of all nationalities. They're not perfect, of course. There are plenty of scandals in sport. But no human institutions are perfect, and certainly not governments, which more and more want to get involved in sport. Now, the most defensible arguments for public spending, which have been touched on to some extent already, are, I think, threefold. And I draw my conclusions on this from a reading of party manifestos, from the DCMS website, and from the relevant article of the Treaty of Lisbon. The three things which I think crop up time and again are boosting health and fitness, we've already heard a little bit about that, social inclusion, and economic growth and regeneration. However, actual spending patterns don't seem to match up very well with these kind of factors. In any case, it is obvious that public spending is necessary to support some of these objectives. What is actually stopping people from taking more exercise to boost their health and fitness, for example? We've actually got some information on this. Social Trends 2011 reported on some survey data on this. The major barrier quoted by 40% of respondents to taking further exercise or taking part in sport is lack of time. Only 7% mentioned expense, and only 2% mentioned lack of facilities nearby. In any case, what expenses incurred in going for a run, for example, or even regular walks, both of which would probably boost health by as much as working out at an overpriced and state-subsidised gym. As for social inclusion, which is mentioned very often in this context, it's never very clear exactly what this means, but only 1% of respondents to the survey mentioned a lack of friends as being a reason why they didn't go on organised exercise. Economic regeneration. That's usually cited as a justification for expenditure on mega events, as they're called in the literature, of which the Olympics is obviously the most obvious case at the moment, but we can think of also World Cups and Commonwealth Games and things like this. Careful analysis by economists such as Holger Preuss at the University of Mainz, who's a friend of mine, suggests that arguments on these lines are often self-interested hype, and anyway ignore knock-on effects of displacement. To take as an example, the so-called boost to tourism, which we're expected to get from the Olympics this summer, will not be a net gain. If hotels are booked up by fans who are coming for the Olympics, they're not available for people who would have come to London for the theatre or for museums, which will presumably experience a corresponding downturn in their revenue. Job creation is another overhyped benefit associated with regeneration. Many of the jobs associated with the Olympics are short-term and may have gone anyway disproportionately to more highly skilled or committed overseas workers than to the unemployed of Newham or Tower Hamlets. Employment at the new Westfield Centre at Stratford, in any case, I think, is going to be producing longer-lasting jobs than those which have been started at the nearby Olympic venues. And as for the much vaunted legacy of the Games, the recent experience of countries like Australia and Greece does not bode well. Much of the Games infrastructure has already been mentioned, is likely to be given away at knockdown prices and put to non-sporting use, or else left to rot. And there certainly doesn't seem to be, as yet at least, much evidence that young people's participation in sport is going to be one of the legacy outcomes. It hasn't risen even temporarily in the short run, let alone the longer term. Indeed, there's some evidence from a rather embarrassed Sport England survey published in December that participation actually fell in 2011 compared with the previous year. So much of the testable argument for government spending in sport is, to use a technical term, twaddle. Politicians, and possibly many of the public, would argue more nebulously that a high profile in sport boosts national morale and the country's profile and reputation and so on. And possibly there is something in this. Although we should note that the UK's highest sporting profile worldwide is surely that of the Premier League, which is a purely private operation. Successful bids for mega events like the Olympics may boost morale and profile, at least those of the politicians who like to be at the centre of attention. But what of unsuccessful bids? Like most of you, I think, I won't forget for a long time the humiliating fiasco of our FIFA World Cup bid, where our Prime Minister, our future King, and gods amongst mortals like David Beckham wasted a ridiculous amount of time and self-respect sucking up to a collection of crooks and conmen who laughed at us behind our backs. We should not have wasted political capital in this way, and I hope that next time we bid for something, our political leaders will stay quietly away from the action. A final point I will make is that government involvement in sport feeds on itself, as has been mentioned earlier on. And in Coalition Britain, it's going way beyond any legitimate concern of government. Because we have a Minister of Sport, he and his team have to interfere in everything to justify their position. So he's been having a pop at all sorts of targets recently, from school sport to the England rugby team's performance at the World Cup to John Terry's captaincy. Every day a new quote. I recently drew attention in an IEA blog to the DCMS response to a rather flatulent parliamentary report on football. Our government is now demanding the FA, the Football Association, which remember is an immensely successful private body, which next year will celebrate its 150th year. It's 150 years old. But the DCMS is demanding that it develops a new board structure, it makes major changes to its representative structure from the grassroots game, and introduces a licensing system for clubs. And it's been told if it doesn't produce an acceptable plan by the end of this month, legislation will follow to deal with this. Going beyond this, in this response, the DCMS presumes to give official opinion on such matters as the creation of a supporters liaison office, which is a good idea apparently, the sale of clubs' grounds, which is a bad idea, the compulsory release of club players to internationals, another apparently good idea, despite it probably being a breach of contract, and so on. So there's a whole range of things where the DCMS is just telling football what it ought to be doing. It even goes on to suggest a high-profile FA campaign against transphobia, which, if you're not up to the minute on your political correctness, means the hostile response to those changing gender. I have to say that as a regular football supporter for the last 50 years, I've yet to note this as a problem again. Remember that none of this involves public money. And so I think in a sense, as Mark was saying, it's not just a question about reducing public expenditure. It's about changing attitudes, it's about changing the quality of government as well as the quantity of public spend. None of these things, which we're talking about there in that FA response, involve public money or existing breaches of the law, where governments could be said to have a legitimate role. As you'll have gathered from my remarks earlier about the World Cup bid, I'm not the hugest fan of FIFA. But I have to say, Sepp Blatter is quite right to insist that governments should stay out of football and other sports, to stay out of their governance and policies. We're a free country, we're not some old-style Soviet bloc operation where everything should be subordinated to the state. So in conclusion, I will be very happy indeed to see the back of the DCMS's role in sports. Where there's some plausible reason for public expenditure, for example, perhaps community sports facilities in poor areas, this should be the prerogative of local government, preferably raising its own revenue in conjunction with the private sector. Where there are legitimate reasons for government intervention in other areas, for example, competition policy in relation to sports broadcasting, things like that, or taxation issues as related to the football creditors rule, for example, these things can and they should be handled by other government departments. So I'm in conclusion with the rest of the panel in saying that DCMS should go the way of the dodo.